Shipping, billing, admin, payroll, marketing. You're managing all the things, so why waste time sending important documents the old-fashioned way? Mail and ship when you want, how you want with Stamps.com. Print postage on demand 24/7 and schedule pickups from your office or home. Save up to 90% with automated rate shopping. That's why over 1 million small businesses trust Stamps.com. Go to Stamps.com and use code PODCAST to try Stamps.com risk-free for 60 days.
911, what's the nature of your emergency?
Welcome back to the Tactical Living Podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Welton, joined by Sergeant Welton. And how are you?
I'm good.
Today, I want to talk about a psychological concept called protective silence conditioning. And I feel like for police officers in particular, silence feels a lot safer when you are behind the badge.
That's something like I think about it is you grow so accustomed to the noise, the radio going off all the time, that you have so much going on in so many different just on your day to day, to where when there's silence, it almost feels uncomfortable in some ways. But then when you have that silence of not going out and talking about things, you keep your mouth shut a lot more than because there's so much background noise.
Yeah, and I think that being silent, it's not just restricted to how things are going on the job, right? Like somebody does something and instead of speaking up, you're quiet, and that protection of the badge kind of makes you feel a little bit more secure in it because maybe everybody else does it. But also not talking about what you feel and not asking for help and not naming the weight that you carry. Silence does become this sort of form of protection, and it shields you from judgment, vulnerability, the fear of being misunderstood. But I also think that over time, that kind of silence is what's going to isolate you from the support, the connection, and the healing, especially when you work in such a demanding job like in law enforcement.
Yeah, I think people start seeing that as your normal, and like they'll say, oh, well, he or she's just quiet and they're not talking about whatever's going on. And you start breeding this silence across through your partners, through your supervisors, whoever it may be, and you start seeing it because, oh, that's how I'm supposed to respond in these instances, is just not saying anything.
It's interesting because I feel like silence is actually rewarded in law enforcement and basically in the entire first responder culture. But when it becomes internalized, what happens is that becomes your default coping strategy, not only at work, but you bring that home too into your personal life.
Yeah, because you get so accustomed to it to where when you're going through something and you're having that silent battle going on internally, you're not sharing it with your partners, with your supervisors, with your loved ones at home. And it just starts creating the separation from your family to where they don't know what's going on and you're not telling them anything.
There could be a lot of reasons why this happened too. I've certainly been guilty of the psychological concept of protective silence conditioning. And in my mind, there are certain times where I just choose to. It's a lot. I don't want to put in the emotional or the physical effort to be able to have that confrontation or whatever it is. So in my mind, it's almost like I have notebooks for certain elements of my life or elements with people or certain people altogether. And it's almost as though when that circumstance or that topic of conversation comes up again, instead of me speaking up, I'm constantly observing, and I'll pull out that notebook in my mind, and then I'll kind of jot down these certain notes on that, and I tuck it away.
Yeah, and it's being able to have this file folder to be able to switch through those notebooks, and because you're able to express it, but it's still there if you need to bring it up for any future kind of conversation or any point where you need to be able to express it.
You know, when it comes to protective silence conditioning, it happens when individuals basically learn, and it could be through culture or experience, that staying quiet is the safest way to be able to maintain that control or that belonging or that perceived strength. And that's why we see it so prevalent in law enforcement.
Yeah, I think we start having this mindset is if we talk about this, then we're seen as weak, or we're seen as someone who's too emotionally imbalanced to be able to effectively do our jobs.
Totally. And I think too that a lot of people might have concerns about the career impact or peer expectations. You also have things like stoic leadership models, and then of course survival-based emotional suppression.
Yeah, we start creating these barriers. We start having these false responses to the reality of things, and I think it starts hindering us in our response to the community, our response to our partners, and really being able to have a stable mindset with anything and everything that we do.
You know, what I've learned in working in the law enforcement community is that over time, though, that silence stops being something that you're choosing, like in the example that I gave, and then it actually becomes automatic. And there are a lot of reasons why silence might start to feel safer than speaking up. And I think that the number one thing is we're all afraid of judgment. We have that ego that comes into play all of the time, and silence protects you and your reputation.
Yeah, and I think that's where we fail each other in law enforcement of, you know, we judge each other so much, or we talk crap behind someone's back because they expressed this, or they showed this emotion, or they explained this in such a way to where, and I think it comes from both sides of the spectrum, is there's some people that are like, whoa, you need to chill out a little bit. And then others, they start compartmentalizing so much to where they're not being expressive at all.
Yeah, something else that I see is that you might not want to burden other people, or you minimize your struggles to protect those other people around you, or the worst of all is comparison, right? Like, I'll use an example just because it's an unfortunate common one where somebody might come in and you guys are changing out or whatever's happening, and the conversation starts to shift over to home life, and your partner starts talking with you about how his wife just had a miscarriage and they're going through this really hard time. And the thing that you're carrying by comparison is not even something that you feel is worthy to bring up, even though it's something that you probably should have gotten off of your chest.
Yeah, and I think that's where we put on our cop hat in those instances, to where you're not bringing in your own personal experience or your own personal feelings in when it comes down to it, because in some instances, you know, you're trying to compare apples to apples, and others it's apples to oranges, but in all reality, it's just having that space and time to be able to express your feelings, your emotions, just kind of what's going on a regular basis.
I'm thinking of one officer in particular who I've worked with in a professional capacity and a personal capacity for a very long time. And I'm thinking about all of the times where he shared with me, I've never said that to somebody before, or I've never felt comfortable being able to talk about this. And I think that for some people, they might have never seen vulnerability modeled in a safe way, or they've never been in a situation to where vulnerability has been, like a container has been placed around them to where they feel comfortable enough to be able to open up in that way.
Yeah, and that's where I think with us, and from a supervisory aspect, is one, it's being there for your people, and it's being there and asking them those questions of, how are you? I asked one of my guys a question recently, and it baffled his mind when I asked him this, and I said, who are you? And he paused and he looked at me, and it was kind of going down the conversation that we were having was about different agencies and stuff like that. And I asked him, I go, but who are you? And he literally stopped and was quiet for like 30 seconds and goes, I've never had anyone ask me that before. And it was really like shocking to see his wheels start turning and to start thinking about that dynamic of who he is and being able to express himself and not identify him as himself as a cop, as a husband, and to really look into who he is as an individual.
With the world that we're in, and I'm so grateful for AI and all things tech, but what we're getting so far away from is being able to just sit there in our own thoughts and have those conversations in our mind, and to deep think and to have that stillness and that silence. And so questions like that are very thought provoking in that way. And that might have been an element of the shock, apart from nobody's ever asked that particular question. And I think it's really important to know that there are ways to be able to break the silence that we might be having with not having certain conversations, whether it's with ourselves or other people, without actually breaking yourself. And one of the most important things, I think, is to start with the impact and not necessarily the details. And this could be opening up to yourself, a journal, a minister, a colleague, whatever it is, and just sharing like this really shitty thing happened. And you don't necessarily have to go into the detail, but you should go into the reality of how it's impacting you. This shitty thing happened. I've been super stressed out. I'm not sleeping at night. Every time that I wake up in the morning, this is the first thing that I'm thinking about. This is how it's impacting my performance, how my day-to-day is going, and start going into how things are impacting you and not necessarily whatever the thing was that caused it.
Yeah, because when you start approaching those topics and those subjects, you're able to start diagnosing how you can change that dynamic for yourself. Because if you start looking at the what's the word I'm looking for, the symptoms of that problem instead of the problem itself, you can start addressing those one by one.
And here's the truth. Processing your stress is actually going to improve your performance. It does not weaken it. I can promise you that. And one of the easiest things that we could do is to just reframe speaking up as tactical maintenance. I hope you've gotten some value out of today's episode. If you have, do us a favor, drop a review, subscribe down below. And as always, know that I'm sending you a long, tight hug from my home to yours.